Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our reading of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, where we are not just talking about the book, I am reading it to you. I had somebody email me yesterday about this and say, why, when you're introducing these videos, don't you say our class on Pride and Prejudice? I should think the answer to that would be fairly obvious. I don't like the lack of parity in a classroom. I don't like the top-down attitude. And also, on a far more practical level, I'm not actually teaching this book. I'm learning as much about it from all of you in your comments on every chapter as you might be learning from me. So it's a conversation. It's an animated conversation. And there is a bit of weight imbalance on the seesaw. I have read this book more times than probably any of you. And I'm also a long-time experienced critic. So there may be things that I might see. There may be things that I might point out to you that you haven't thought of yourself, but it's still a conversation, and I'm just doing this battered old Penguin paperback. I was switching from edition to edition, but I'm just sticking with this thing, especially since I think this reading is going to kill this book, and what an honorable way to go. So we are up to chapter 42 in Pride and Prejudice, which was originally issued in serial form, in volumes. So this is the last chapter of volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice, which was a triple-decker. And once again, drama is being introduced into our story by movement, or the prospect of movement. In the first volume of Pride and Prejudice, it was introduced not by any movement of our characters, but by movement of others. People came in to Meryton. They came into the neighborhood, and that stirred things up. But lately, it's been the movement of our characters. Jane, the eldest and prettiest of the Bennett sisters, has gone to London to visit her people there, and maybe to try to ease her heart from it being broken about losing Mr. Bingley. And Elizabeth has gone to Hunsford Parsonage. She's gone to visit her old friend Charlotte Lucas, and that brings her into direct contact with Charlotte's husband, Mr. Collins, who first pitched woo to Elizabeth, but also, more importantly, to Mr. Collins' patroness, the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and her nephew, Mr. Darcy. And Darcy proposes to her, out of the blue, to her, and she refuses him very vigorously and impugns his character on 2 different issues. And he is wounded, and he withdraws, and he writes a long letter exculpating himself and gives it to her, and she reads it, and then rereads it, and then studies it, and then studies her own behavior and changes. The letter changes her. It changes her view of the world. It erases a certain element of personal innocence that she had had up until that moment about a lot of things, not least of which about Mr. Wickham, Darcy's childhood friend, who had previously sold Elizabeth on a sob story about how badly Darcy treated him. Darcy has defended himself on that charge and reversed it. And Elizabeth now knows that Mr. Wickham is a thoroughgoing lemon shark, that he's a cad, and that he's not to be believed about his stories. Little does she guess how much more on her guard she should be on that very point. She's happy that Mr. Wickham and his regiment are leaving Meryton. They're leaving for Brighton, for the area of Brighton. She's happy about that. And therefore, she's alarmed when Kitty and Lydia, the 2 youngest and dumbest of the Bennett girls, start agitating for the family to go to Brighton for the summer. So that they talk about sea air and sea bathing, but they want to be near the officers that they moon over all the time. And Elizabeth actually goes so far as to go to their father in private and urge him to forbid the visit. Forbid any such trip, because Lydia has been invited privately by the wife of the colonel of the regiment to go, and is intending to accept. Elizabeth wants that not to happen. She has been changed. Her eyes have been opened by Mr. Darcy's letter, and she sees how embarrassing her family behaves in public. And how that can hurt, how that can be the detriment of all of them. Look at the detriment. Look at what it appears to have cost Jane. To say nothing of what it ultimately cost Elizabeth up to this point. It's Darcy's loudish insistence on how bad her family is, and yet he's overcoming that to offer his hand, that incenses her so much that she refuses him. If the family had been more acceptable, those notes would not have been there, and she might have said yes. Or at least tabled the subject for further discussion instead of an absolute no in the most ringing terms imaginable. She goes to Mr. Bennett and says, "You really ought not to allow this. Her behavior will eventually stain us all." And Mr. Bennett doesn't care. He just doesn't care. All he's concerned with is that the sillier his little girl acts, the funnier it will be. The more he'll be able to chuckle at it in private in his study. Doesn't care about any of the rest of it. And you could say that maybe he doesn't care because he's been long inured to it by the marriage with his wife, who was very much like Kitty. But I don't think that's a good excuse. And clearly Jane Austen at this point must think that a little bit more exploration on that very subject is necessary, because that's how she closes out this chapter, with a little bit more of that. In other words, we're not going to say that Jane Austen does it. We're going to say the narrator does it. We're going to say the person who is telling us this story does this. Now, I've already said, I've made it clear to you, and over the years on BookTube, and for decades teaching this book, I've made it clear that I have lots of issues with the narrator of this book. I know that Pride and Prejudice is never brought forward as a Huck Finn example of an unreliable narrator, but I think this narrator is very unreliable. I think if you look at just what people are saying and doing, which this narrator usually reports with reportorial accuracy, you can easily read different than what the narrator is saying. But we're going to see. We're going to see what the narrator has to say about this whole business of the Bennett family before we wrap up this volume of the book. So this is chapter 42. Sorry for the long throat clearing. 6 minutes of throat clearing is bad. Had Elizabeth's opinion been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to any real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennett was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment which his own imprudence had brought on in any of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly and their vice. Would Mr. Bennett agree with any of this? Is the question you have to ask yourself. This is being put forward as the law of Moses down from Mount Sinai, but would he agree with any of this? He was fond of the country and of books, and for these tastes had arisen his principal enjoyments. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe to his wife, but where other powers of entertainment are wanting, the true philosopher will derive benefit from such as are given. Nice. Very nice. So this is the narrator of Pride and Prejudice trying to sound like warmed over William Makepeace Thackeray or something of that kind. Although I might quibble here, and maybe some of you will know the laws of Georgian finance better than I do, but surely Mr. Bennett is getting more from his wife than just tacit amusement when he's alone in his library. She has, it's not large by Bingley or Darcy standard, but she has a fairly large amount of money that's drawing interest. Surely that's adding to the family income. It's not just sitting around waiting for her to die. But I could be wrong about that. I wasn't good at finances in the Georgian era, and I'm not good at them now. Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behavior as a husband. She had always seen it with pain. This is pretty deep stuff. But respecting his abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavored to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly reprehensible. As I said, pretty deep. This is the narrator pointing out what the reader may not even have noticed until now, which is Mr. Bennett is not just privately laughing at his wife. He's mocking her in front of the children and encouraging them to do the same. Just because they don't, because Jane is too good and Elizabeth is too forgiving and the girls are too stupid, who knows what Mary thinks of her mother? But just because they don't all openly do it doesn't mean that it's right for him to do that. So, but she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage. nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged a direction of talents which rightly used might at least to preserve the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. If Mr. Bennett had tried, had cared, had been passionate about anything, he could have done both. He could have brought his daughters up right. They didn't even have teachers. He could have brought his daughters up right, and he could have changed his wife's nature. A bit. Restrained it, just a bit. He could have done both. If he were stronger. I say if he were more conscientious or if he were less lazy. But at the end of the book, he's going to show us that it's also just a matter of personal strength. He isn't strong enough. And he ought not to be proud of that fact. And he is. But anyway, let's just keep going. We'll never get through this chapter. When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause for satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. Their parties abroad were less varied than before, and at home she had a mother and sister whose constant repinings at the dullness of everything around them threw a real gloom over their domestic circle. And though Kitty might in time regain her natural degree of sense, since the disturbers of her brain were removed, her other sister, from whose disposition greater evil might be apprehended, was likely to be hardened in all her folly and assurance by a situation of such double danger as the watering place and a camp. The watering place here being Brighton, which then, as now, is a sinkhole of corruption. Upon the whole, therefore, she found that what had been sometimes found before, that an event to which she had looked forward with impatient desire did not in taking place bring all the satisfaction she had promised herself. It was consequently necessary to name some other period for the commencement of actual felicity, to have some other point on which her wishes and hopes might be fixed, and by again enjoying the pleasures of anticipation, console herself for the present and prepare for another disappointment. Her tour of the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts, and it was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable. And could she have included Jane in her scheme, every part of it would have been perfect. This is a long-winded way of saying that Elizabeth is consoling herself by looking forward to things. Do you do the same thing? Do you always have a thing just a little bit down the line in the future that you look forward to help you pull you through the grayer or the more tedious parts of any given day? Not that your life is a misery. Of course, Elizabeth's life is not a misery. She's very, very young, keep in mind. But not that your life is a misery, but do you ever do that anyway? That, I'm looking forward to this. And sometimes I'm just going to pull myself along a little by latching onto that thing that's just a little down the line and concentrating on it. And the phenomenon that the narrator is describing here is that the thing that Elizabeth was originally looking forward to was the departure of the regiment, which she thought would make life a lot less embarrassing. Her two sisters would not be so continuously embarrassing themselves if the regiment, with all its pretty officers, weren't around anymore. So she was looking forward to that. And now she's looking forward to her trip to the lake. She's taking a long, extended walking tour of the Lake District with the Gardners. But it is fortunate, thought she, that I have something to wish for. Were the whole arrangement complete, my disappointment would be certain. But here, by carrying with me one ceaseless source of regret in my sister's absence, I may reasonably hope to have all my expectations of pleasure realized. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and general disappointment is only warded off by the defense of some little particular vexation. When Lydia went away, she promised to write very often and very minutely to her mother and Kitty, but her letters were always long expected and always very short. Those to her mother contained little else than that they had just returned from the library where such and such officers had attended them, where she had seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild, and she had a new gown or a new parasol, which she would have described more fully, but was obliged to leave off in a violent hurry, as Mrs. Forster called her, or they were going to the camp. And from her correspondence with her sister there was still less to be learnt, for her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. Her letters to Kitty are all full of scandalous gossip about the officers themselves. Although notice, that bit about the shawls and the parasols, the gowns and the parasols, means that Kitty is still spending money. Her parents' money. She's still racking up bills in Brighton. After the first fortnight or 3 weeks of her absence, health good humor and cheerfulness began to reappear at Longbourn. Everything wore a happier aspect. The families who had been in town for the winter came back again, and the summer finery and summer engagements arose. Mrs. Bennett was restored to her usual querulous serenity. And by the middle of June, Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Meryton without tears. An event of such happy promise as to make Elizabeth hope that by the following Christmas she might be so tolerably reasonable as not to mention an officer above once a day, unless by some cruel and malicious arrangement of the War Office another regiment should be quartered in Meryton. That very, very, very distant echo you hear, that mention of the War Office, that very distant echo you hear is that while Jane Austen was writing all this wonderful fluffy prose about these country inconsequential trivialities, England was at war with Napoleon. Jane Austen's own kith and kin were in that war, putting their own flesh on the line. The War Office, about as good an echo as we ever get. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, and a fortnight only was wanting of it. So Elizabeth leaves in 2 weeks. She can't think of anything else. When a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner, which at once delayed its commencement and curtailed its extent. Oh no. Elizabeth has been using this to get through her days. Mr. Gardiner would be prevented by business from setting out till a fortnight later in July, and must be in London again within a month. And as that left too short a period for them to go so far and see so much as they had proposed, or at least to see it with the leisure and comfort they had built on, they were obliged to give up the lakes and substitute a more contracted tour, and according to the present plan, were to go no farther northward than Derbyshire. In that county, there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks, and to Mrs. Gardiner it had a particularly strong attraction. The town where she had formerly passed some years of her life, and where they were now to spend a few days, was probably as great an object of her curiosity as all the celebrated beauties of great houses like Matlock, Chatsworth, Dovedale, or the Peak. And here I might put in a tiny little word for Derbyshire, because what was true then is true now. It is an absolutely wonderful place to walk through, to bicycle through. It is absolutely beautiful, mostly wonderful, certainly wonderful people. I don't, I guess, explicitly advise that you tramp through it with a crowd of beagles, because that'll take you a long time. But visit, if you can, visit. For all I know, actually, if any of you live in the area, you're never going to see Derbyshire, are you? Do you want to cross over? You want to go over your Bering Strait to your chair? You could do it, Frida. There you go. Yay! All right. Here, let me get this out of your way there. Anyway, for all I know, you can take a Jane Austen style tour in Derbyshire where you're in a carriage and whatnot, and duplicate the route that is vaguely sketched in this book. That'd be a lot of fun. I never saw such a thing when I was tramping around with the aforementioned crowd of beagles, but it might happen. Elizabeth was excessively disappointed. No wonder. She wanted to go to the lakes. And she had set her heart on seeing the lakes, and still thought there might have been time enough. Well, there would have been time enough if they were Americans, because Americans do this sort of crap all the time when they take a vacation. They have a week, so they decide to see Florence, Venice, and Rome. And to the extent that when they get home, they're exhausted, they have blurry, bad pictures of things they don't remember, and did not experience anything of those places. That's the way typical tourists always travel poorly. They do that exact thing, and it ruins the experience for them. The Gardiners had something else in mind. They wanted to travel, yes, far, but also leisurely, so they could take it all in. Now that's not going to happen. Elizabeth, she's very young, so she's thinking, well, surely we had time to do it all in a month. But no, it's a wise decision on their part. But it was her business to be satisfied, and certainly her temper to be happy, and all was soon right again. It's her business to be satisfied because she's not paying for any of this. The Gardiners are treating her to it all. She's going with them. So whatever they decide, yeah, you had better not complain. With the mention of Derbyshire, there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for her to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner. Pemberley is another great house, and its owner is Mr. Darcy. But surely, she said, I may enter his country with impunity and rob it of a few petrified spars without his perceiving me. That would be fossilized wood. Probably was a little fad at the time to pick up stuff like that. when you were touring like this, when you were going on vacation. It could be fossilized wood, maybe an actual fossil, a trilobite or something, or a shark tooth from a river or something like that. The period of expectation was now doubled. Yes, because she was leaving in a fortnight, but they've had to postpone it, so she's now got a month to wait. 4 weeks were to pass away before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did pass away, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, did at length appear at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old and 2 younger boys, were to be left under the particular care of their cousin Jane, who was the general favorite, and whose steady sense and sweetness of temper exactly adapted her for attending to them in every way, teasing them, playing with them, and loving them. We saw these little moppets briefly earlier when Elizabeth first goes to the Gardiner house in London, and they're too afraid to come all the way down the stairs to meet the newcomers, but they're too curious to stay in their room, so they come halfway. And Jane is their adored goddess, so they are all going to spend time with her. The Gardiners stayed only one night at Longbourn and set off next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that of suitableness of companions, a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to bear inconveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence which might supply it among themselves if there were disappointments abroad. Any of you who have ever done any traveling, any long-term traveling, will be cheering out loud at this paragraph. Yes, that is the most important thing in the world if you are not traveling either alone or, in my case, with plenty of people who speak my language and plenty of people who are never going to disagree with me, and I'm not going to disagree with them. But if you're traveling with humans, it is so important to have the right traveling companions. It is so important not only to have the right traveling companions, but to be the right kind of traveling companion yourself. So many wonders of Luxor or Iceland can be ruined if your traveling companions aren't good. So it's great that here the Gardiners and Elizabeth know already that they are all of one mind. They will be perky. They will smile at inconveniences, the inevitable inconveniences of travel. They will amuse each other when the outside world is not amusing. Wonderful. Absolutely. Well, not a major part of the book, but I'm glad Jane Austen, or the narrator, puts a paragraph in here about it. It is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor of any of the remarkable places through which their route thither lay. Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, etc. are sufficiently known. A small part of Derbyshire is all the present concern. To the little town of Lambton, the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former residence, and where she had lately learned that some acquaintances still remain, they bent their steps, after having seen all the principal wonders of the country, and within 5 miles of Lambton, Elizabeth found from her aunt that Pemberley was situated. It was not in their direct road, nor more than a mile or two out of it. In talking over their route the evening before, Mrs. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Note that word again. I maintain that we don't know as much as we wish we would about Mrs. Gardiner. Mr. Gardiner declared his willingness, and Elizabeth was applied to for her approbation. Of course, it's the last place on earth she wants to go. But she's not a paying member of this excursion, and she also doesn't want to be a bad travel host. "My love, should you not like to see a place for which you have heard so much?" said her aunt. "A place, too, with which so many of your acquaintances are connected. Wickham passed all his youth there, you know." Little does her aunt guess that Elizabeth was offered the chance to be the mistress of Pemberley. It would be her property now. Elizabeth was distressed. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley, and was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. She must own that she was tired of great houses after going over so many. She really had no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. Mrs. Gardiner abused her stupidity. "If it were merely a fine house richly furnished," said she, "I should not care about it myself. But the grounds are delightful. They have some of the finest woods in the country." Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place instantly occurred. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea, and thought it would be better to speak openly to her aunt than to run such a risk. But against this there were objections. She finally resolved that it could be the last resort, and if her private inquiries as to the absence of the family were unfavorably answered, meaning Elizabeth is going to ask around and find out whether or not the Darcys are in residence at Pemberley. If they aren't, Well, it was a fairly standard thing if you were touring around and you seemed respectable to go in and ask, knock at the door. Can we come in and look at the long picture gallery? Can we roam about the garden? Can we walk about the woods, on the pathways of the woods? It's lovely. It's picturesque. We don't want to impose, but we would love to do that. Nowadays, it's an absolutely going concern. Now you check your schedule ahead of time online. You bring the pocket money you need to see these places, and maybe tips, generous tips and whatnot, and you can make an excursion of it. A really good excursion. It's actually a really good idea for a vacation, a holiday. Way too many people that I knew when I spent time in England, way too many people that I knew were saving their money industriously so that they could be browbeaten and hurried from Rome to Florence to Venice. And never even thought about doing this, about going to Hertfordshire, just touring Hertfordshire. Never even thought about doing it. I would say to them, why don't you do that? What, your money would go so much farther and it would be so much more memorable, so enjoyable. But I ran into the same wall there that I run into with Americans, saving and scrimping for their travel money so that they can be browbeaten from Florence to Rome to Venice instead of going. How many Americans have seen the Grand Canyon? I would wager that on vacation, more of them think about going to Italy than think about going to the Grand Canyon or the Badlands or the Painted Desert. Anyway, so she has to find out first. She'll drop the bomb on Mrs. Gardner and say, look, I don't want to go to Pemberley, and maybe even tell her why. But first, it might not be necessary. Accordingly, when she retired at night, she asked the chambermaid whether Pemberley was not a very fine place, and what was the name of the proprietor, and with no little alarm, whether the family were down for the summer. A most welcome negative followed the last question, and her alarms being now removed, she was at leisure to feel a great deal of curiosity to see the house herself. And when the subject was revived the next morning, and she was again applied to, could readily answer, and with a proper air of indifference, that she had not really any dislike to the scheme. To Pemberley, therefore, they were to go. And that ends this part. We are now at volume 3. Because Elizabeth is in the country and is going to go to Mr. Darcy's home. We are now at volume 3, and volume 3 might as well be titled Release the Velociraptors. All sorts of things are about to pop off. Are you ready? We'll do it together. Thank you, Book 2.